Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. My name's Mark Littlewood. I'm Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, one of your co-hosts for the programme of events in Think Tent, and it's my great honour to be chairing this panel. For the late arrivals, there are still some of the extremely expensive seats available at the front of the auditorium, so please do come and fill those up. Firstly, I should say my thanks to RSSB for sponsoring this event. I'll be thanking Mark as well for speaking, as well as RSSB for supporting it. We've got a pretty easy task, actually, because in the next hour we're going to put to rights all of the issues to deal with British Rail and British Railways. And I'm very confident, given that the panel we've got before us, that we can knock this on the head with about 5 minutes to spare. So thank you very much for joining us. Let me just tell you the rules of engagement. I'm going to introduce the panellists in the order in which they're going to speak. I'm then going to give each of them 5 minutes to set the scene. I'm not a particularly draconian chairman, so after 6 minutes I'll start to do this. After 7 minutes, I'll do it loudly, and after 7.5 minutes, a trap door will open under your feet and you'll disappear from the stage. So do try and keep to time. And of course, the issue we're tackling is an important and timely one, with the Williams review finally concluding and a fresh government plan on the future of railways. What does the next decade or so of rail look like here in the United Kingdom? There's some uncertainty, I guess, around the long-term impact of the pandemic on business travel, commuter behaviour and the like. And what will the new body, Great British Railways, bring to the table to meet the challenges ahead? And of course, the IEA being a free market think tank, you can expect some questions from me about whether we have a more or less market-orientated approach to rail. So let me introduce our esteemed panellists. On my immediate left is Mark Phillips, the CEO of the Rail Safety and Standards Board and member of Transport for London's board. He has over 30 years of experience working in the rail industry. Shortly after joining the Rail Safety and Standards Board as Director of Research and Standards in 2015, he was appointed CEO in 2016. So, Mark, welcome. On my far left is Hugh Merriman, the Conservative Member of Parliament for Bexhill and Battle. He was elected as Chairman of the Transport Select Committee in January 2020 and has been a committee member since 2015, so comes with bags of experience. He has chaired or is chairing, you can clarify for us which are in the present tense and which are in the past, Hugh, a whole range of inquiries on international travel, HS2, decarbonising rail, zero emissions vehicles, smart motorways, road pricing, recovering public transport post-pandemic and e-scooters. Every inquiry underpins the question as to how decarbonisation of transport will be delivered. He was first elected to Parliament in 2015 and has also served as the Parliamentary Private Secretary to Philip Hammond when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. To my immediate right is Mary Grant, the CEO of Porterbrook, which she joined in 2017. Mary has over 24 years' experience, so you're only 6 behind Mark here, right? It's a fairly close race, working in the UK and international transport sector. Your previous roles include leading Eurostar's New Fleet Introduction and Business Change Programme. You've also been the Managing Director of New Business Development at National Express, Divisional Managing Director, Bus and Rail at First Group, and Managing Director of ScotRail. Quite a CV. And it says here you have a proven track record of improving operational performance and delivering financial success. So we'll want the nuggets that have successfully delivered that. And you're a board member of the Rail Industry Association and the National Skills Academy for Rail. And last but by no means least, on my far right is Chris Loder, the Conservative MP for West Dorset, elected in 2019. Prior to entering Parliament, Chris had a 20-year career in the rail sector, so 4 behind Mary, but there's quite a high number of years around the table now. Beginning at the front line as a train guard, went on to be head of operations for C2C and working with Deutsche Bahn to look at connecting London and Frankfurt by direct rail. Immediately before being elected as an MP, Chris was head of new trains for his local operator, South Western Railway, where he was widely recognised as the guard that kept the trains running during the strikes in the run-up to the election. And since being elected, Chris now sits on the Transport Committee, which scrutinises the Department for Transport. He has also said, although he is no longer a member of the RMT, he's a former member of the RMT, a distinction which no other Member of Parliament has on either side of the House, he tells me. So please give a very warm welcome to our panel. So thank you all for joining us. Mark, I wonder if I can begin with you with setting the scene.
Thank you very much, Mark. So over the pandemic, I think it has brought us to the cusp, really, of three potential options for rail in the future. Managed decline, the status quo, or growth. If we take managed decline, there is certainly some view in Treasury that, frankly, the economy cannot afford to continue to pump the levels of investment into rail that it has done over the past year. Over £10 billion of additional public taxpayers' money went in to keep the industry sustained in the pandemic. And I think it's notable that you heard very little from the rail industry during that period compared to the private aviation sector, who were regularly appearing on news programmes to argue for the case for more flexibility and for the aviation sector to be opened up. It's certainly the case that electric vehicles are now proceeding apace. 1 in 4 inquiries are now about an electric vehicle, so it's much more a consideration that sustainable car transport for the future is a very good alternative to travelling by rail. If that actually happens and fares remain relatively high compared to alternative forms of private transport, then services will be thinned and routes potentially cut. And we've obviously experienced some of that during the pandemic, where we've tried to better match the supply of train services against the demand. And the outcome of that potentially is that you see more communities that lose their rail connection, and that's particularly well outlined, I think, in Seb Payne's current book that he published a few weeks ago about the broken heartlands, where you see a lot of northeast communities that have lost their rail service from the beaching era and afterwards. The status quo means very much accepting the important contribution that rail makes currently, carrying on with a certain level of investment akin to what we have now, and also ensuring that there is prudent cost cutting to make sure that it is reasonably efficient for driving some economic growth. But where we want to get to is a rail industry that actually drives the economy and drives better prospects for the UK. But to do that, we need a much better integrated public rail service that fits better with buses and trams and other local transport solutions. And I would argue at the moment there's very little cross-thinking in the department, particularly in Horseferry Road, about how you get that integration of rail services with other network services, particularly at a local level, so that you get integrated ticketing and better connections between those types of services. So certainly better working with devolved authorities and subnational bodies, governments in Scotland and Wales is going to be absolutely vital to ensure a comprehensive rail system for the future. We also do need to look at better flexible ticketing. The offering that's been released in the last few months is probably insufficient to really attract people back to using rail in a significant degree. We need better passenger information so that customers can travel with confidence. I think at the moment you do have to have a fairly good understanding about how the network operates in order to feel confident about travelling, particularly where you're making a wide number of connections. The new arrangements will mean a transfer of responsibilities from a lot of the train operators into Great Britain's railways, and they're going to have to make sure that they are suitably equipped with the right level of capable staff to drive the commercial thinking of the future. And we do need to think about the degree to which contracts will continue to operate to the degree that they have in the past. Yes, we need to ensure we've got good private sector involvement, but it needs to be done in a way that's easy to do business. Some of the contracts that have existed and have been seen to fail are largely a result of the flaws in the system, the overly complex nature of those contractual relationships. And to be successful, we need something that's much more streamlined and much more effective. So I think that's all I wanted to say, and I'll pass on back to you.
You've kept brilliantly to time. What a model example to your fellow panellists. Thanks very much, Mark. Hugh, the floor is yours.
Mark, thank you very much indeed to you and the IEA, and Mark, to you and the RSSB for having me here. It's a real pleasure to speak with you all. I want to talk about the role that the private sector has actually played in rail, and actually talk up rail from the last 20 or so years, and why that's important right now. So just look back sort of 20 years ago or so. Since then, we've managed to double the number of passengers on trains. It's been an absolute great success. We've sweat the asset in a manner that no other EU country has done. It's been the second safest railway after Ireland. It's been the second highest in terms of customer satisfaction, many of you may be surprised to hear, after Finland. And so what it's also done is actually put money into the exchequer. So largely it's left the government to spend billions of pounds on the big infrastructure that rail's needed, and then the rail passenger has actually paid the fares. And in fact, the year pre-pandemic, we actually saw 200 million going in net to the Treasury from that model. So, of course, what we've got now is a situation looking in September, as one case point, rail back to about 55% of its pre-pandemic numbers. That's why the Treasury has had to pump in about £10 billion. And Mark's right to look at the Treasury because they're not going to carry on doing that. But in my view, where do we look at to get the rail industry back in terms of those numbers where it's been before? By actually looking at the private sector that's got the proven track record in delivering it. Now, I would absolutely agree that the franchising model was broken. I think everybody accepts that. But again, part of the problem was that it became too complex and also too costly to bid. So as a result, we saw very few bidders coming through, wasn't competitive, and direct awards were made instead. So again, I would argue that rather than the private sector perhaps breaking the franchise system, we just made it far too difficult and not very appealing for the private sector to do so. So we are where we are. But the concern I have with Great British Railways is ultimately I must have a huge amount of time for the chief executive and chairman of Network Rail. I think they do a brilliant job. Network Rail is still largely an engineering entity. And what Network Rail will now be doing is effectively providing not just the sort of arm's length entity that then contracts with the private sector to deliver a concessionary service. It will also be providing part of the Network Rail aspect as well. So Network Rail is going to have to massively evolve from an engineering entity to an entity which really understands customer service and those levels. And the other concern I have is that Great British Railways will become so large that it could end up taking out the private sector involvement. So a great example is how we actually buy our tickets. At the moment, you can buy them from an entity, you can buy them from Trainline. If you're just buying them from Great British Railways, then it may well be that they squeeze out Trainline from that market. And I would just look back to the days of British Rail. I know people look back with rose-tinted spectacles. I don't actually remember using British Rail, but for those that do, they do not give a particularly good taste of it, and it costs the taxpayer a heck of a lot of money to deliver a very poor service. Last point I'm going to make, Mark, before you bang that glass. There is a requirement for the industry to find about £1.5 billion worth of savings at a really difficult time. That's about 15% of the customer revenue prior to the pandemic. So there's a danger. The one good thing we've had through the last 18 months has been a really good, cohesive working together from the operators, from government, and indeed from the workforce. My concern as we actually look for those efficiency savings is we could see industrial action. I do think we need workplace reform. There are too many Spanish practices on the railway, but my concern is at a time when we're trying to reform, we could end up in dispute. So I'm positive about the future as long as we keep the private sector in the mix, because as I say, they're the ones that double the passenger numbers. At a time when you need those numbers back, that's the kind of recipe that we need.
Hugh, thank you again. Stuck brilliantly to time. You could trade a minute of your time to one of our last two panelists. Mary, let me go to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark, and also to Mark as well for hosting the event today. So I also am very optimistic about rail in the future, and can say now I'm a bit of a veteran on the descendancy, not ascendancy, but I have seen a lot of change. I've seen a lot of very positive elements of franchising, and also a lot of and substantial investment for the private sector over the last 20 plus years that has driven this industry into being the backbone of our transport network. We're seeing it more from a passenger perspective. We'll have a debate, I'm sure, shortly about freight and where freight sits on that. But let's not forget that the whole change in the Williams-Shapps white paper and that plan all came about because of a very bad customer experience. A customer experience that was actually galvanising probably a decline based on some of the issues that both Mark and Hugh have raised of over-complexity, a reorientation of what the private sector is really good at delivering. And obviously Porterbrook is one of the founding private rolling stock asset owners out of British Rail. And I think what we mustn't forget about in this future is the customer and the optimism of getting back to 1.8 billion passenger journeys, being in a different context. It won't be in the same way of the morning and evening peaks. You know, who's now got to say that the weekends will be the peak periods, engineering works will be done on a Monday morning at 7 o'clock, whatever. But if we keep this simple and we think of the base premise of actually what we will attract back, then I think the confidence can be there to get the volumes back, to get the revenue back, to give Treasury confidence. You said you might probe me later, Mark, about, you know, what was my proven track record. I generally kept things simple. I'm a farmer's daughter. We're quite simple people. It's your basics. And also it's all about people. So really understanding that customer base, very diverse, attracting the connectivity. Mark talked about having a truly intermodal transport system, making it delightfully easy, embracing digital. But of course the other area, and a board that I sit on is National Skills Academy for Rail, is skills. Because we're operating in a future environment that's going to be very different. We're having a very sophisticated customer base. We've got new, very sophisticated pieces of equipment. That requires a new type of skilled workforce to support what has been an ageing workforce that we're starting to see transform out of the industry. So there's a lot to go at. The controlling mind, I hope, is a guiding mind. I'm sure we'll have a debate on that. If it's a guiding mind and it's an outcome base, we have an opportunity to really get the best of all parts of the industry to take forward this next chapter and deliver what should be a truly great, highly safe passenger railway, and also provide the capacity which the Williams-Shapps plan has allocated is for freight as well, which is also a very important part because there's a whole decarbonisation agenda. So we're in the middle of a challenging outcome of the pandemic. We are looking at what the future should be in terms of supporting decarbonisation, using public transport and rail being the backbone of that. And we also have to work in a digital and software environment, so skills is key to making that a success. So a lot to go for, but I'm also very optimistic that we can actually crack this.
Well, you've all done brilliant at sticking to time. Chris, you're going to make that 4 out of 4, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon, everybody. I first of all just want to say that in 2017, we started to see a considerable trend of change on the part of our passengers and customers. They had started to change their habits. They used to travel Monday to Friday, every morning, every evening. They started at the beginning of 2017 to travel 4 days a week, and Fridays were really quiet. And then Mondays were quieter. And as time went on, up until the pandemic, we basically saw a Tuesday to Thursday peak railway, and then the rest of the time was quiet. And that what has happened during the pandemic is it has exacerbated that trend. It has sped it up. And that is why we've seen regional centres, Southampton, Exeter, Portsmouth, Basingstoke, Reading, being much more resilient to commuter traffic returning than other parts of the network, and particularly in terms of London. But what's happened now is we've got clearly the Great British Railways proposal. That is absolutely going to take what has started to happen and give the government and the private sector the opportunity to make the most of the railway in the future. Now, as a rural MP for West Dorset, it really riles me when I look at the stats and find that if you live in London, the public grant, the public subsidy per capita is just over £46 per person. In rural Dorset, as is the case in most of rural England, it's a tenth at £4.60. We have a big debate going on about decarbonisation in the transport sector today, and it's an important one. But for most of my constituents and those of other MPs across rural Britain, they don't actually have a bus or a train service to be able to decarbonise in the first place. So I think we have to bear that in mind. But in terms of GBR and its future, we've talked about bus and rail integration. Part of the reason this paper has come forward is because I'm afraid certain parts of the private sector have failed to achieve this. Why is it that I have the same private sector owner of the local bus services and 3 railway lines in my constituency, but they will not, it's not a case of can't, they will not, probably for their own commercial reasons, make that integration work? That is unfortunate, but it's a reality, I'm afraid, of one of the downsides to where the private sector will not work to make that achieve those things. And it has almost forced the government to act in the way to grasp it, along with a number of other issues and difficulties. But I think it's also fair to say that we had a debate earlier on this morning with a Railways Minister about the May 2018 timetable, and I challenged the Minister as to what he said, because he outlined at that point that actually the railway had failed in the May 2018 timetable. Maybe not word for word, I should be careful what I say, I've read the papers this morning. So I just think it's really important that we also see this opportunity as something to reform the DFT as well. The DFT, before the current minister's tenure, have specified undeliverable timetables for too long. They have given the private sector no ability to properly deliver in some cases, and that has also reflected poorly on the private sector as well. So what we've got in front of us now, in terms of this white paper, in terms of this proposal, is an opportunity that will not only reform, I hope, the DFT and how it works. I'm sorry it might appear to be a bit more bureaucracy, because I don't want more bureaucracy. We need to thin it down, we need to slim it. We need to make sure that the private sector still has the ability to bring the brilliant things it has brought to the railway since privatisation, which has doubled passenger numbers over that period of time. And we need to make sure also that private investors still maintain their confidence in that they don't feel, nor are subject to, the prospect of a very public sector, very bureaucratic organisation such as Network Rail, in effect, taking control. I think, Mary, I think you said about the more guidance rather than control of the future. That is important. It's important we have streamlined decision-making, less bureaucracy, and that we can achieve much more for our passengers, not just for passengers, of course, but for freight, because that's increasingly going to be important in this world as well. I'll hand back to you.
5 minutes and 1 second. That was just brilliantly timed, Absolutely superb. Well, listen, I'm going to come over to you in the audience, so do stick your hand in the air if you'd like to ask a question. But I'm going to abuse my power of the chair by asking a question to each of the panellists first. The IEA is obviously interested in making markets work in each and every sector. And I was in a discussion the other day about GBR, and one of my IEA colleagues says, in effect, this is the renationalisation of the railways. To which another one of my colleagues said, nah, they weren't even properly privatised in the first place. Right? What I'd like to hear from each panellist, and Hugh, I'll start with you, is does this change give us confidence that markets will start to work better? Or have we sort of given up on the market mechanism in this sector and we're just trying to organise it better through, through GBR and, I don't know, a different role for DFT? So is this a diminution of the market? And if that was required, what went wrong in the market for rail since privatisation? Hugh?
So, Mark, I think your colleague is right, because if you consider that, as I said, rail was not just breaking even, it was actually paying money into the Treasury. And yet those that were taking the risk of those franchises were being told effectively where their trains had to stop and how often, and actually what the fares would be. If you consider buses, for example, where we do put about £2.5 billion worth of subsidy in, and yet we never did that to the bus market. So you can actually argue it's the wrong way round in terms of taxpayer money. Competition has been tried, open access on the rail network, it's very difficult to deliver. It has been used up on the East Coast, but it is actually incredibly difficult, not least because if you look at some of the busy routes in the southeast, they're completely congested as is. So I would say that perhaps there's been a sort of reluctant feeling that things are not working, so therefore has to change. But I'll still come back to where it went wrong. And that to me is we made the franchise system, the bidding process, so expensive. Again, not just telling private companies how they'd effectively have to run their private risk, but also making it just far too unwieldy. I mean, it went from sort of like a narrow document right up to here. And it just needs an army of lawyers to look at it, to bid, and so they didn't. And so therefore, all that happened in the end is we were directly awarding the franchise. And so to a certain extent, you may as well move to the concessionary model that we're talking about now. Word of caution though, Southern Rail, which is in my constituency, has been a very challenging operation. That has effectively been the market that we're actually looking at now, where the government took all the risk and the reward, and Southern then sort of paid the fare box back and got paid a fee to run it. And that was not a great success. So just a word of caution that this is not necessarily the sort of holy panacea that we're walking into.
Mary, what's your take? Did the market fail here, or didn't we allow it to function sufficiently? From what Hugh was saying, the kind of barriers to entry and bidding were so high that perhaps you then get just the incumbents stay in. And are we moving to making markets work, or simply sort of shrugging our shoulders and saying, really, the competitive market doesn't work here as much as we'd hoped?
I think the easy answer would be to say, we've stifled. So, if you go back to 2012, I think when I did some analysis to submit to the Williams report at the time, was one of the highest levels of both customer satisfaction. It's when franchising models were at their most simplest. It was more outcome-based. And when you won a franchise, generally your share price was value accretive, not the other way, because of all the risk, the safety risk that you also take in running these. However, we're also battling in a good way. It's a very positive thing, not for the last 18 months, with a quantum and volume of passenger journeys that are it's outstripping the capacity on the network. So there lies another challenge from an infrastructure perspective, because some of the infrastructure that the services are running on, albeit it was very congested, morning, evening peaks, Monday, Friday was the typical sort of big volume earning journeys, were struggling to cope. Now, the answer was then, let's just load on timetables, let's just get longer trains, because that'll bring back revenue in. We didn't look at also an energy strategy, because in a number of the networks, quite simply, some of the new fleets that have been procured, there's not really enough power to be able to run those trains at the full speed and with all the customer attributes on board. So I think we started looking, or the industry started looking at franchising in a very siloed perspective and not looking at it from a strategic way. That's what I hope that GBR will bring back, but still create as well an entrepreneurial out-based, probably trusting, but I'm maybe being a bit too optimistic on saying that, but I think that's where we could get the best of the best back.
Chris, you were mentioning the failure of different transport companies to integrate, that the sort of private sector have failed here, and you sort of said it might not be in their commercial interests. I'm interested in exploring that a bit more, because to my mind, for the market to work, the incentives and the interests of the commercial provider should align with the interests of the customers. So I don't quite know why that didn't work, and I'm trying to get to the nub of whether we've really seen a market failure or merely a poorly designed market.
Well, I think a bit of both, actually. I mean, the example I gave you was that the reason that happens ultimately is because you've got one private operator that can get money out of the council for running some bus services, and if they don't run them freely, they can push harder or pull a harder political lever on the council to cough up more public money that way. And then, of course, you've got the railways that, there are many commercial levers that private sector operators use to get more money out of the DfT to run an extra train service or two. And the structure of it has meant that it's been in the commercial interest of some private sector businesses to manipulate that. But I don't think I think that's very different to some of the issues that we were talking about. Mrs. Thatcher didn't really want to privatise the railways because she saw it was too complicated, too difficult, and it would probably be it caused more problems than it would solve. And then, of course, we went through the real pain, didn't we, at the beginning of privatisation when Railtrack came in to existence to operate the infrastructure privately. And, of course, that's evolved over time. But from what I can see and through my experiences, the structure of how that industry, of how the rail industry has come about, has actually been too complicated. It's generated too many interfaces in the most part, but it has allowed private sector investment, especially in rolling stock, and the amount of money that has benefited the taxpayer has been enormous. I mean, Mary's much better qualified to talk about that than I am. It has been enormous, and that often does not feature in this debate, and it ought to. But I'm afraid we've gotten to a point, I've talked about some things that were exacerbated through COVID. We have gotten to a point where the private sector wasn't able to deliver, mainly because, I think, of industry bureaucracy. If you go back to the very beginning of the railways in this country, you had railways, the actual trains and the infrastructure all in one company. It was, LMS, and then it was GWR, and then it was LSWR down to the southwest. Partly, a bit provocative, I know, but never mind. Partly EU rules and regulations. The various EU rail packages have required infrastructure and train operations to be separate. That has been the law in this country until we left the European Union. This opportunity allows us, I think, not just, we've had too many ministers for too long say, closer integration, we're going to work closely together. You know it's all nonsense as well as I do. I saw it firsthand. You don't get any more opportunity to influence Network Rail in that sort of arrangement. But now I think GBR really does have the opportunity, if it's done properly, to ensure that the private sector investment and inputs work, but the model of the industry changes to make sure it is more competitive. Because let's face it, if you're travelling from Salisbury to London, Sherborne to London, you don't have consumer choice. Let's not fool ourselves that the railway is a free market for the consumer, because it is not. If you go from Woking or Guildford to London, you don't have a choice.
Well, you can drive.
Well, you can drive, but you don't have a choice by train.
Yeah, but that's a competitive feature. Right?
Well, it is, but the railways could be more competitive if we really wanted to go down that avenue. And a little while ago, I remember Stagecoach, some 6-7 years ago, put forward proposals to look at how we could offer more consumer choice for long distance routes by selling groups of train paths throughout the day. It was quite innovative, it was quite challenging. I recommend that that's something we revisit to think about. But nonetheless, we can make this work, but it's going to depend on a lot of different aspects.
Mark, cheer up a market-orientated person such as myself who is concerned we're going back to central planning, nationalisation, we're not allowing the market mechanism to work, or is this new structure going to put that right and allow the right competitive pressures and incentives to align?
I think the jury's out on that, to be honest. The first 15 years, probably up until the financial crash in 2008, the franchising system worked reasonably well. The private sector was enabled the eking out of efficiencies that had continued from the British Rail period, and certainly the train operating companies were able to drive forward some marginal revenue growth from the resources that they actually had. But then I think after the financial crash, particularly for those train operators in and around the southeast where employment prospects dropped for a period, they did suffer financially, and that drove a new mindset and much more competitive tendering for bids. And essentially, these are businesses, their revenue often is £1 billion or more, so they are cash generative, but their balance sheets are very weak. They do not have the ability to withstand any risk of any significant nature. And in fact, the final stage of winning any franchise is to negotiate with the DfT or Transport Scotland, Transport for Wales, what are known as the final risk assumptions. So which risks will move over to the DfT in the event that they occur, and which ones will stay with the franchisee. And that's probably the most commercial part of the discussion in many senses, because depending on the arrangements that transpire or the environment that you then find operating the business in after you've got it, will very much determine the degree to which you can continue to sustain it. But one of the reasons that cost of resourcing the train operating company, staff costs have gone up so much is because there's no ability really to withstand containing them, because the businesses are not funded sufficiently to prevent that, because you just have to accept the risk in the short run. It's more efficient. I think the challenge that GBR has is again letting a lot potentially of these new contracts in a fairly short space of time, one assumes, and with the benefits of hindsight, the companies that are prepared to bid for them are going to be very, hopefully, curious and thoughtful about the degree to which they actually want to take on that risk. So I think the jury is most definitely out as to what will commercial companies get out of running these things rather than just reputational damage.
Well, I promised we were going to crack this entire problem within an hour. We've used just over half our time. I suspect we're about halfway there, but I'm now going to appeal to you, the audience, to get us over the line to ask your question. So if you can stick your hand in the air if you'd like to ask a question. I'll start at the back there. Just to be clear, you can ask a question, make a comment. You can give a speech as long as it's only one sentence long and ends in a question mark. And if you can wait till the microphone gets to you and just say who you are and where you're from. Don't need your life story, just who you are and where you're from will do.
Hi, George Robinson from Trainline. Q, we welcome your comments. GBR obviously presents lots of questions for us, and I think there's always lots of talk about what competition can deliver to supply GBR, but there's also, I think, bigger questions around those who actually have to compete directly against GBR as well, as Trainline will have to do. So, and talking about private risk as well, we are a fully private company. If we don't sell tickets, we don't make money. I think we are a lot of what is good in the current railway, certainly. So, how can we maintain that? How can we try and convince GBR, a body that will be made up of institutions which potentially don't have much commercial expertise, how can we make sure that commercial expertise, entrepreneurial flair, is baked into GBR from the beginning to ensure that private involvement from companies like Trainline or whoever lasts into the future?
Okay, I'll take a couple more before coming back to the panel. The gentleman in the blue shirt here, and then I'll come to the gentleman at the front.
Hello, Jack Richardson, Rutland and Melton. Over this conference, we've heard lots about devolution and how different communities can be empowered. But do you think there could be any role in the future for combined authorities such as Manchester, West Midland and West Midlands going forward in the rail network? Thank you.
Okay, and if you can just wait, sir, at the front for the microphone to get to you.
Is it on? Yes. My name's Ian Potts and I come from Ealing in London. To pick up Chris and Mark's point about competition, next year when we come to Birmingham, I'll have a choice of 2 lines from London to Birmingham between them. And when I was a young kid living in Liverpool, I had 3 choices, obviously all run by British Rail at the time, but 3 ways of getting from Liverpool to Manchester. There are routes that can be made competitive. Why aren't they?
Okay. Let me go right round the panel. Mary, perhaps I'll start with you. So just to remind you, George was asking about Trainline. Are we actually basically going to see the suffocation, the crowding out by the public sector of enterprise that, happy to be, stand on their own 2 feet and try and provide that service? Will they be able to do it? Jack asked about the possibility of combined authorities, and Ian says, that at least in a number of instances, interconnections between major cities, there seems to be, on the face of it, the opportunity for straight-out cutthroat competition. Why isn't it happening?
So, in terms of entrepreneurial flair that we hope to see within GBR, really, we've heard a lot within the Williams-Shapps plan about private sector involvement. And I think it's incumbent upon us that are within the sector, and I'm also one of the true private parts of that sector, to hold ministers to account, to say, to make this successful, you need that blend. And I certainly will be keeping a very watchful eye as well, because you're right, you need a combination of skill. There's some excellent civil servants. You need also an investing structured finance team. You need real operational knowledge and entrepreneurial capability. So I think we have to keep a watching eye on that one.
Mark.
I think, firstly, in terms of the issue of competing routes, I mean, that does exist on some bits of the network. You've got 2 operators providing services between Southend and Liverpool Street, for example. The question is how you can efficiently organise letting those concessions such that they don't become more expensive by breaking them all up into small parts. And the reason that we have the current arrangements, not necessarily the best, but one of the reasons we have the current arrangements is to try to reduce the overhead cost of operating them. And so that's one of the reasons that they're structured in that way. I think perhaps to George's point about how do we get the commercial expertise into GBR, I think ultimately it is about giving the chief executive of that organisation bottom line accountability for a single till. So if you take Transport for London, the commissioner there is fully accountable for ensuring that the cost and revenues balance, and certainly up until the pandemic, where there was no government grant, that is what occurred, and the organisation set its task and it's organised itself around achieving that objective, and the senior team were incentivised on that basis. And I think that's going to be the key thing in terms of how GBR is structured, very much, the corporate governance arrangements around it.
Hugh, let me come to you. Whenever I see a sort of state effort competing with private enterprise, my heart is always beating for the private enterprise, but the smart money is usually on the state crowding them out. Why can George and I actually take succour from what the present arrangements are going to be?
So in order to deliver your true heart and George's bottom line, we need to make sure there's an absolute culture shift so that GBR, as it starts its days run by Network Rail, they're going to have to bring in parts of the industry that have been the private sector and really understand it. And so their whole mindset is actually how do we sort of contract it out to the private sector and let them get on with it? How do we incentivise them to grow the railways, not just pay them a fee? Because it's bad value for the taxpayer, because there's no incentive for them to actually return everything back and be ruthlessly efficient. So we've got to really load up the incentives so the private sector can earn more as the passenger numbers grow. Not a great start, I have to say, because the industry has just been through these termination payments of franchises, where the government has had the whip hand and has been working out the termination costs and saying, actually, we believe this franchise would have gone out of business, you'd have lost your bond, therefore pay us this. And my concern is that that's been a bruising exercise for industry and sort of may put them off. So I think there's work to be done there. Coming back to Jack's point, interesting, the Williams-Shapps review talks about devolution and the role for it, but you can see a bit of a sort of contradiction between the regional bodies that are going to be set up to run this and also the local authority model. So I think that has to be worked out and focused on and not just words. And then to come to Ian's point, that we'll all throw a bit of competition at you. Birmingham, obviously, you've got two options, Chiltern Line or Euston. You're about to get a third with HS2 once it gets delivered. But it has been really difficult to deliver competition. There is absolutely no doubt. And therefore, I think part of the factor for that is it's so expensive to lay new rail down. It costs us £2.5 million per kilometre of electric track. The Germans, Mark, can do that at £750,000. And that's not just because they're ruthlessly efficient, they are, but also they've got a rolling programme. So they carry on building in their workforce. But we start, and it means that it puts our costs up.
Chris, your thoughts on any of these three? Train line, can they compete? Combined authorities, is that another way of approaching it? And are we really squeezing and exploiting the competition that should exist on a good number of lines, even if that wouldn't necessarily be the case in, say, West Dorset, right?
Yeah, there's a few things to cover there, isn't it? I mean, I think we should be pleased that we have some very experienced private sector managers at the head of Network Rail at the moment in various different roles. I've worked for Andrew Haynes previously. I worked for him at South West Trains when he was the operations and then managing director. And I know he's an incredibly brilliant leader of the rail industry, as far as I'm concerned, from a commercial train operator point of view. And the same to be said for other senior executives within Network Rail. What we have to just bear in mind, though, is that their experiences are from a little while ago and things have moved on quite considerably. And I think making sure that private sector involvement, things like Trainline and others, probably now is the time to influence the transition arrangements from today into the future by, I say secondments, those sorts of things, actually actively offering those insights and to persuade those who are running that transition to make sure that we are getting the best. And frankly, if you're not seeing that and the private sector isn't getting what they need, that's one of the reasons why Hugh and I do the job we do to challenge the DfT and others to make sure that they are doing that. The combined authorities point, role in rail, I'm sorry, I think you asked it, sir, didn't you? Yeah, I believe the combined authorities role in this respect is an added level of bureaucracy and pain and a nightmare. So I don't want them really to personally, if they're going to merge lots of local authorities together as one local authority, not another tier, because combined local authorities are another tier. If you're going to have a unitary, that's different. But this extra tier of bureaucracy, which we see now with the subnational transport bodies, all that is, I'm afraid, is an excuse to restart again the strategy thinking and and all the work that happened 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, and to recost the same amount of money. Network Rail, for example, has done route study after route study after route study, and we've seen nothing happen as a result of quite a lot of those things in my neck of the woods. And in terms of the competition points, well, you're right in terms of what you said for those routes. But this is all about, if you don't have a choice, you have to travel at a time. The reality is we have a regulated fares set up at the moment. And it's not quite right that the general public believe that it's nasty private sector operators that choose to put fares up by 2, 3, 4% a year. It's not mandated by the government, and unfortunately the private sector takes the brunt of that. The regulated fares, reality is, it's about peak fares coming into and out of London or in other places where they're quite high. It's my opinion that the regulated fares setup that we have today is actually pushing people off of the railway full stop, because they can now work from home. They either choose to travel later and therefore lower the yield and therefore the revenue coming into the bank, or they choose to stay at home. And my advice to the Treasury has been that if there's one thing that needs to be reviewed very quickly, it's the whole approach to regulated fares and the peak fares arrangements that we have today.
All right, let me come back to the audience. Seeing any other questions in the air. I'll take one from over there, then on the aisle, then this gentleman in the white shirt there. Again, if you could introduce yourself, please, that would be great.
Tim Morris, UK Major Ports Group. Ports are huge rail freight users. We want to do more. We have constrained capacity to do more. Are you as similarly positive about GBR for rail freight as you have been on some of the other aspects that you've talked about?
Okay, thank you very much. Then gentleman there at the back. You.
Andrew, I'm not representing anyone but myself. So
Good man,
I'm just
good man.
wondering, does the panel have any criticisms of the idea of, instead of regional monopolies enforced by the government, just tender out each individual time slot, similar to the small package group that the MP for Dorset mentioned?
Okay, and then there's a gentleman here about 3, and if you can just wait for the microphone, that would be terrific.
Thank you. Charles Prevost, Southampton, Itching Conservatives. So I work in the gas industry, which is a kind of natural monopoly and a regulated asset-based kind of model as well. And what I was wondering was, is there anything that the rail industry can learn from that model where you have a range of different gas suppliers, which are private competitors? They buy gas off a shipper who puts gas into the network, and then the network operator is paid a fee by that shipper, whether they're Cadent Gas or Northern Gas Networks, etc. They're private companies but regulated to not abuse the monopoly. Is there anything from that industry setup that can be learned in the rail industry?
Well, let me start with you. So just to refresh your memory, Tim asked about ports and freight. We talked a lot about passengers. Are you optimistic about GBR there? Andrew asked whether actually that isn't the right solution just to go for time slot sales. And Charles from the great city of Southampton asked whether there are other models elsewhere, perhaps gas, but perhaps others, that have got this apparent natural monopoly problem that perhaps have been able to work.
Thank you. In terms of ports and freight, Williams-Shapps has been quite strong, I think, in terms of making sure that freight has, dare I say, better protections than perhaps it's had historically. And I would also argue that I think the current freight operators have performed particularly strongly during the last year or two, such that their presence on the network, I think, is better assured than it has been for a long time. And I think there will be a lot of ministerial interest, I think, to make sure that their opportunity to continue to grow is developed. And I think particularly in terms of the door-to-door type of operation that we're seeing with local couriers, I think there's some new opportunities in that sector that will come to the fore particularly. In terms of auctioning, shall we say, slots for timetable services, it's one of those things that has a lot of theoretical appeal. And in the mid to late 90s, when I was actually working here in Manchester, when the franchising process was just kicking off, there were a number of parties that were interested in running local services on some of the regional routes out of Manchester. But again, it's back to the practical operations about the cost of actually providing the resource, the rolling stock lease from companies such as Mary's, the train crew provision, the marketing services you need to put behind it. That's what then makes it very difficult to build a good commercial case, and therefore you bunch these services together and you end up with a concession or a franchise. And at the moment, that's, I think, one of the drawbacks, although it sounds very, very effective in theory. And in terms of alternative models, I think one potential certainly should be thinking about possibly putting all of the thing back into one, and how you might regulate that better. I mean, BR did get to quite a good place with its sectorisation of Intercity, Network South East, ScotRail and regional railways, and there could well be some benefits, I think, personally, in looking at that option as well. But that's a personal view rather than a company view.
Mary, pick up on any or all of those three. Tim asked about how you think freight will go, time slots being the best auction method, and are there any other models in these apparent natural monopoly sectors that we might rely on for rail?
Okay. So, Mark, I'm going to pick up on Tim and Andrew's.
Okay.
So, 2 points. So, I think again, as Mark said, the reference of freight and Williams-Shapps, I've never seen it so prominently written to secure, so tick. Secondly, the freight organisations themselves are mobilising in terms of what they see as their longer term growth trajectory. Some of their challenges at the moment has been able to get hoppers, wagons, also how they respond to the whole decarbonisation challenge on locos, but there is definitely a move towards shoring up kit to be able to take the quantums that goes beyond coal and stone, which was then ultimately the decline of freight for a period of time, but light logistics as well. So we're starting to see passenger trains that are being stripped out and being used for light logistics. Royal Mail have just done a contract as well, so that takes you to a city-to-city location. So I think there's a whole new agenda for freight, which is very positive and strong, and other fixed infrastructure around ports and accessibility onto the main line is being looked at, and that's something that we're also actively doing as well from a private financing perspective. Andrew, to your point on slots, and why don't we just sort of put them out and do it on an individual basis. I think one of my biggest concerns on that, whilst I think it merits consideration, anything does at this day, is actually coming into Mark's area of safety. Now we pride ourselves as being, one of the safest industries for rail in the world, but if you're coming in to use multiple operators, and also you're working with variable workforce, variable equipment, all the maintenance regimes, all the other infrastructure and safety principles that a railway, regardless of what country it's in, is hugely complex. I think I would have a question about ensuring that we can deliver the customer experience, but also do so and maintain that level of safety, which is always our first and foremost in any operator's mind.
Chris, pick up any or all of those 3 points.
Yeah, so I would agree with the points from Mark and Mary about the rail freight positivity. If I'm perfectly honest with you, I don't think the rail freight sector is taking advantage of it enough. I've got a fairly considerable background in the railway. I've heard from one rail freight company in recent times. The others don't share anything they want to do very much. So I think there's something like a bit of a PR exercise to be done actually in that respect. And I'm surprised not to see more in the way of sort of almost tentative track access requests going in. Because actually the rail freight sector was in a hugely strong position when the passenger service was depleted. a huge negotiating position to rebalance out access to the network, and I'm really surprised that sector didn't really take advantage of doing that, because it had a strong place to do it. In terms of the criticisms and the points he's making, we were talking about earlier about the groups of paths. I again agree with Mark about the more commuter style operations, but for long distance, I think there is something to be considered about it. And I'm not talking about the reason open access, when it fails, is because it just have 2 or 3 trains a day between 2 or 3 points. You know, the very sad Wrexham and Shropshire story at the end was a brilliant example of this. It was the best quality operation, I think, in the entire country. It was excellent, but commercially didn't wash because basically you had 3 trains a day, your overheads were excessive compared to what you could deliver and the revenue you could generate. I think if you're talking about 8, 9, 10 trains a day, there is a conversation to be had about that, but I don't think we are going in that direction. Well, as I said, I think it's good to have a discussion about it. You know, I really think there is benefit from it, and I'm really sorry that actually Stagecoach are not part of this discussion at the moment. And I think they are. Hugh mentioned earlier one of the organisations that have been sort of been charred a little bit through this exercise. I think Stagecoach could very well have been one of them. They offered a huge amount to the rail sector, and I'm sorry they're not part of it at the moment. And so, in terms of your question. I think the rail sector today, or should I say before the days of emergency measures agreements and so on, was pretty much aligned to how the gas sector works broadly. And I think the issues we're seeing in the gas sector today are actually because of these peaks and troughs that was referred to earlier. I think that model is also creaking at the seams, and I don't think there's anything to learn from it.
Hugh, do you want to pick up on any of those points?
Very briefly, because I'm the last to go. I mean, I think to Tim's point, absolutely in terms of rail freight, and I think that the timetable has been reduced a little from where we were before. I think it's unlikely to come back because of the cost of running the railway. So there's more of a window for freight now. And also what we've seen over the last week in terms of our reliance on HGVs, it can be quite fragile. So, why is it the case that we expect people to drive from one end of the country and back again with goods when you can actually have rail freight delivering it from port, and then you've got a much shorter journey, great for the carbon footprint, but also actually might attract people to work on a shift basis in the HGV industry, because the average age is 55 years old of an HGV driver for a reason. The only people that will tolerate it are those who've known it all their life, or were foreign labour and were willing to put up with the conditions. So now is the moment for freight, and I think that freight does, I would agree with Chris, needs to get its grouping together and come and see us. Just in terms of Andrew and Charles's points, I mean, I was thinking to myself, well, it doesn't work because you've got the rail, you've only got one bit of rail, it's so expensive. But you could say the same thing about there's only one bit of Gatwick Airport runway, and you still have slots taken off there. So it comes back to Mark's point, because we think the private system has failed, but actually we never really let it compete and offer. The reality is, though, we are going in a direction, which is why I feel, concessionary model, make sure those contracts really incentivise those private companies to grow that market so that they share in the proceeds and are incentivised to do so. So I like both your ideas, but I'm afraid that sort of train never passed, I suppose I should say.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're basically clean out of time. I promised at the outset that we'd crack the problem in an hour. We've had 58 and a half minutes and nearly got there, which is a pretty noble effort by audience and panellists alike. Just before you go, there's plenty more happening in Think Tent over the next couple of days. In 15 minutes' time, the next session here, run by our partners here, the Taxpayers Alliance, is on a panel discussion on the topic, are the Conservatives now the party of high tax and high spend? At 4:30 p.m, I'll be back on the stage in conversation with Steve Baker MP. One of the questions I will be asking him is, are the Conservatives now the party of high tax and high spend? So if you want to come back for that, then please do. Thank you very much for your contributions from the floor, but please join me in thanking not just RSSB for their generous sponsorship of this event and helping us put it together, for which we're enormously grateful, but for their contributions from Hugh, Mark, Mary and Chris. Thank you all. Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.